It was once regarded as Asia's freest city. A thriving, semi-autonomous region and an open economy that had become the world's envy. But today, sweeping changes to its internal security and electoral laws have sapped the vitality and freedom that the city was once famous for.
In Beijing's view, they will think they still keep Hong Kong's autonomy under one country, two systems. But in many people's view, particularly many Hong Kongers' view, they will think the autonomy already had been jeopardized.
There's a complete now loss of so-called law and order in town. So that clearly now gives Beijing leaders no choice to step in.
The new laws have granted Beijing sweeping powers to exert its control over the city, launch a crackdown on dissent, and curb the growth of anti-China sentiment.
People have been arrested, a lot have been detained, and they will arrest more people.
It was very anti-China. There were calls for Hong Kong independence. There were attempts to overthrow the government. So I think Beijing has no choice but to overhaul our electoral system.
Is Hong Kong's freedom under attack? Has the last vestige of democracy been crushed following the introduction of these laws? And with China tightening its grip over the city, will Hong Kong gradually lose its sparkle and competitive edge as a global financial hub? July 1st, 2021. Exactly 24 years since Hong Kong's sovereignty was transferred to China from Britain, bringing an end to more than 150 years of British colonial rule.
等我哋一齊為國家嘅富強康盛，為香港嘅繁榮安定乾杯。
The handover ceremony was held amid a relatively tense but more subdued political environment in the city. The massive protests which rocked Hong Kong just a year ago is now largely non-existent. Fear has now crept into the city as concerns grow over a possible crackdown by the authorities following the introduction of the new security law on June 30th last year. The law makes it easier for the government to punish protesters. Any acts of secession, subversion, terrorist activities or collusion with foreign forces are now deemed unlawful under the new law.
With the national security law, it has intimidated a lot of people into silence, into self-censorship. So people kept saying, this is no longer the Hong Kong that we used to know. It is very, very sad and very tragic.
When Hong Kong was reunited with the mainland on July 1st, 1997, residents of the city were overwhelmed with a deep sense of uncertainty. There were fears if their rights would disappear overnight. That sentiment was brewing despite the promise that the territory would retain a high degree of autonomy and freedom for the next 50 years under the doctrine of one country, two systems. That guarantee was spelt out in the 1984 Sino-British Joint Declaration and the Basic Law of Hong Kong of 1997.
I think before the handover, the fear and concern is about whether we can safeguard our freedom and our human rights. And actually, after the handover, this fear has been resolved.
Shirley Leung was only 15 when Hong Kong was handed back to China from the British. According to the 39-year-old local journalist, many of her peers left the city together with their families due to fears over the possible erosion of their rights and freedoms under Chinese rule. As for Shirley's family, moving to a foreign country was not an option. even if they had the intention to do so.
We didn't have the ability to migrate, and we have not a very big family. Me and my two sisters, they have 3 kids, and then they're not quite well off, and so I think that wouldn't be an option. But my mother got BNO for all of us, for 3 of us. So I think that's the most clever thing that she ever did throughout our childhood. Because I guess, like, even if they couldn't go migrate, they wanted to let us have options, to have a choice.
While the handover of the territory back to China was greeted with an immense trepidation by some residents in Hong Kong then, a sense of joy, jubilation and anticipation gripped the people in the mainland. Rick Wen was born in Anhui province near Shanghai and was only 7 years old when the handover ceremony took place. Despite his tender age, he could still recall how happy the people were in the mainland. They were glad to know that the territory was finally returning to its rightful owner.
I still can remember that at the time I watched the handover event with my parents, and wow, it's phenomenal. We have a lot of documentaries, a lot of TV news to telling us about the history, about how the negotiation works. The way we see it is just Hong Kong returning home, but I know that there are a lot of different views. But from my point of view as a mainland, we are very happy to see that Hong Kong finally come back to China.
Under the principle of one country, 2 systems, Hong Kong is guaranteed 50 years of effective self-rule. That means its way of life, including the right to free speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of the media, and an independent judiciary remain unchanged until 2047.
That few years, I mean, the government didn't have much controversial policies at that time. So at that time, I was not very aware of the political situation in Hong Kong, just like normal life, as what they said, like 馬照跑冇照跳 for 50 years. So it's for that few years, I guess it's exactly as 馬照跑冇照跳, yeah.
However, over time, the sentiment and sense of optimism about Hong Kong's autonomous status began to change. Some Hong Kongers felt that Beijing had no intention of living up to its promise, and that perception started to develop in 2003, just 6 years after the handover. That was when the government proposed a national security law for the city. The bill would empower the authorities to punish anyone found guilty of acts of treason, sedition, secession, or subversion against mainland China. The government maintained the proposed law was necessary to protect the territory's security.
They could have done this themselves, but they decided that because it's one country, 2 system, they want to make sure that the law itself comply with the local legislation. So they allow Hong Kong to do so ourselves. But we have failed in the past 23 years to pass this law locally.
That proposal, however, drew fierce criticisms from many quarters. Many Hong Kongers were worried that the law could be used to suppress dissent and infringe upon their fundamental rights and freedoms. Hundreds of thousands of Hong Kong residents then took to the streets, calling for the proposed law to be scrapped. The massive public opposition eventually forced the bill to be shelved indefinitely. But the rift between Beijing and the territory had only just begun. So did the level of distress between Beijing and the people of Hong Kong.
There was widespread mistrust at that time. And so eventually a lot of people going to the street. And the first time we have 500,000 people going to the street after the handover. And after that, I think the policy of the Beijing authorities had changed. And they began to question that whether Hong Kong people can govern themselves. Before that, as Beijing always emphasized, the governing of Hong Kong is a matter of the Hong Kong government.
And then in 2012, the authorities tried to amend Hong Kong schools' curriculum to include topics on China's history and culture. The idea was to foster a sense of Chinese identity. Students, parents, and teachers, however, rejected the idea. They decried the move as an effort to brainwash the youth with pro-mainland propaganda. The strong opposition to the bill forced the government to back down. But just before the dust had settled, another controversy began to surface yet again. This time, it was over the 2014 proposal to grant universal suffrage for the selection of the city's chief executive. The ruling, however, stated that only candidates approved by Beijing would be allowed to run in the election. As expected, the proposal was swiftly rejected by protesters. Suddenly, Hong Kong was a sea of yellow as tens of thousands of people took to the streets calling for genuine democracy. The civil resistance was known as the Umbrella Movement, paralyzed parts of the city, blocking roads in several districts. It also drew more than 1 million people to the protest sites.
It's about the universal suffrage that people are asking, and the government is not going to move forward for the democratic system, and so that's the underlying situation. But I guess 2014 it's the burst, because it's the anger piled up from maybe from 2003. Yeah, it's like for 10 years they're piling up. It's like the energy that like grow over time. The problems exist and the government did not solve it, and then the snowball just like rolling and becoming bigger and bigger.
Most of the Hong Kong people expect that we have universal suffrage after the handover. For example, it should be 10 years after the handover. But after that, the Beijing authorities has given you another timetable. But later we find that even they have the timetable, but the proposal proposed by Beijing is not the one that we originally expect, because they have a lot of control on the nominations, and people have been losing their patience on the issue of the universal suffrage, especially the young people.
The government, however, feels that it was a little too premature for the people of Hong Kong to reject the proposal then. To him, it was a huge mistake, and they would now have to live with the repercussions.
It was very unfortunate that the original proposal by the Hong Kong government, obviously with a blessing from central government, on the political reform was not being endorsed and accepted by the opposition. If they would have accepted that proposal, we are one step closer to so-called universal suffrage. I think it's a mistake for many people, and this whole reform should have been taken one step at a time. But at the time, the opposition refused to agree to this, stage approach. They want to see the reform to happen in one go, which I can understand from the mainland authority point of view, right? Because there's so many uncertainty. And then, of course, what happened was many people took to the streets, and that was obviously somewhat shocking to most Hong Kong people at the time. Of course, also to central government as well, when the city was somewhat paralyzed for a good 79 days. So certainly that is not a way to convince leaders in Beijing that Hong Kong people would understand, the national interest. So that clearly is a one step to alienate, the leaders in Beijing.
The occupation of the city officially ended on December 2015, 79 days after it first began on September 28, 2014. However, the protest movement achieved nothing in the way of concessions from the central government. But it set the stage for bigger and violent protests a few years later as Beijing began to lose patience over the growing defiance among the people of the city towards its rule. For the first few years after China restored its sovereignty over Hong Kong, the territory remained one of the freest cities in the world. Hong Kongers enjoyed many of the freedoms not found in any other city on the mainland. There was very little intervention from the central government into its internal affairs, in line with its promise of upholding the one country, two systems principle. That, however, changed in 2003 when a security law was proposed. Since then, Hong Kong has never been the same again. The relationship between Beijing and the people of Hong Kong has since been marked by mutual distrust. Just a few years after the 2014 Umbrella Revolution, another series of massive protests rocked the city yet again. In June 2019, Hong Kong witnessed never-before turnouts of some 2 million people on the streets, protesting against the extremely unpopular extradition bill. The bill, if passed, would have allowed Hong Kong to extradite criminal suspects to mainland China to stand trial. Critics argued the move would expose the former British colony to China's deeply flawed justice system, and that would lead to a further erosion of the city's judicial independence. Several concessions were offered by the authorities to the protest movement in a bid to end the protests, but they were rejected by the protesters who were calling for the bill to be scrapped. It was finally withdrawn in October 2019. The scrapping of the bill was seen as a huge moral victory for the pro-democracy protesters. But that did not bring an end to the cycle of demonstrations. To pro-democracy activists, the battle was no longer against the now defunct extradition bill, but about preserving their freedoms and their way of life.
The government has tried doing a lot of stuff to deprive our civil rights, our human rights. And one of the most distinct character of Hong Kongers, or even the Hong Kong society, is to be different from mainland China. That's like the spirit of Hong Kong. It's a part of China, but it's also not a part of China in a lot of senses. But if the government doesn't see it this way, they want us to be more China, I don't think this is appropriate.
The protest marches soon descended into violence with attacks on government offices, metro stations, and businesses with ties to mainland China. Some young activists even called for Hong Kong's independence from China. The continuing protests and political unrest then convinced Beijing that the time had come for a new security law to be imposed on the city. On June 30th last year, China's top legislature unanimously passed a new national security law for Hong Kong. The law came into force in the territory the same day. The wide-ranging law criminalizes acts of secession, subversion, terrorism, and collusion with foreign forces.
Given what happened to Hong Kong in 2019, second half of the year, I think is by then clearly it tells our Beijing leaders that they have to do something, right? Because there's a complete now loss of so-called law and order in town, right? And we have now increasingly, no longer just a small minority group of radicalized people. They have been inciting violence. They have, inciting a lot of young people to come forward to go against the Hong Kong government as well as the mainland.
But many in the pro-democratic camp feel that the national security law has undermined basic freedoms that the city once enjoyed. 69-year-old former chairperson of the Democratic Party, Emily Lau, for one, maintains that Beijing has gone too far in its efforts to preserve law and order in the city, arguing that the move runs counter to the principle of one country, two systems.
We have to tell Beijing, tell everybody, that this has gone too far. There's no need for such harsh measures for Hong Kong. And the vast majority of the Hong Kong people, they are patriots. They support one country, two systems. They're not fighting for independence or using violence to overthrow the Hong Kong government or Beijing. They just want Beijing to honor the promises of the 1984 Sino-British Joint Declaration and the Basic Law. I'm not against stability. I'm not against prosperity, all these things. But I also want the government to respect the wishes and aspirations of the people.
National security law came as a surprise to many people. I guess at that time Beijing worried about foreign forces. So they would like to use a very, very strong law to curtail foreign forces in Hong Kong. But from many people in Hong Kong, they would think national security law was too much for them. So it created some kind of uncertainty among people. Then now it's the problem of you need to do some self-censorship.
Their fears are not without justification. Hundreds of activists have been rounded up and sentenced to prison, including many young leaders. Veteran democratic activists have also not been spared. Martin Lee, also known as the father of democracy in Hong Kong, was recently found guilty of organizing an unlawful assembly. So was Jimmy Lai, a media mogul and an outspoken critic of Beijing. He was found guilty of the same charge and was sentenced to 14 months jail. The pro-democracy newspaper that he owns, Apple Daily, has also been raided over allegations that its reports had breached the national security law. It has since ceased operations, and 2 of its top editors have been charged for collusion with foreign forces. They face the prospect of life imprisonment.
I understand the concerns about, for example, the closure of Apple Daily. But Apple Daily is no ordinary newspaper. I think it has weaponized itself for more than a decade to stir up protests against the government. Other media, which just carry on voicing criticisms, reporting on life in Hong Kong and in the world, they have nothing to fear. I think the freedom of expression is alive and well in Hong Kong.
A climate of fear and confusion has now descended on the city following the implementation of the controversial national security law. However, that has not deterred people like Emily from speaking up publicly to defend whatever last bit of freedom that they have.
It's not that I'm very brave or whatever, but I have a motto. You have to be bold. You have to be wise. And you have to be careful. So, what I want to do, of course, is not to conduct self-censorship, continue to speak out. They may come and arrest me at 5 a.m. tomorrow. Who knows? But I just refuse to be intimidated into silence. And I just think that what I'm doing is what I have been doing and what I think the basic law and all the other Hong Kong laws allow me to do.
But the freedom once enjoyed by the people in Hong Kong is now gradually narrowing. Even the arts community has not been spared. For example, the M+ Museum has recently come under the spotlight. It has been accused by a group of pro-Beijing politicians of spreading hatred against the country for showing a picture of Chinese dissident artist Ai Weiwei holding up a middle finger in Tiananmen Square. The incident has since sent a chill through the arts community over what it sees as a diminishing freedom of expression in the city. Clara Cheong is an artist and founder of CNG Art Department. The 42-year-old started the gallery space with her husband to give local artists a platform to express social and cultural issues through the arts. But since the imposition of the national security law in the city, it has forced artists to exercise self-censorship. Many are unsure what would happen to them if they were to cross the line.
I think this is quite a big dilemma because the freedom of expression is shrinking. We see that politicians and some of the political leaders have been arrested or being charged, or maybe some are on bail, but yeah, they're being charged and some are really arrested. So I think that really make the whole community in Hong Kong really fearful. It is scary, yeah. And so, but okay, at this moment, we are still seeing that this law is not very clear, I think, and that's another problem. So how much can it really control? How far would it go? We don't know yet at this moment. So that's even more scary.
People try to speak less about political issues. So in generally, this kind of law has a lot of impact on different aspects of social life and political life in Hong Kong. National security law basically was introduced by the central government and using mainland China law system. So most of people, even law practitioners, they don't know what will happen in the future.
Hong Kong's film industry has also come under pressure from the authorities. Films that breach national security legislations have been banned. However, the government says there has never been any ambiguity with regards to the implementation of the security law. And there's very little that the people need to worry about, so long as they don't cross the so-called red lines.
The national security law is quite clear as it spells out to making sure that certain red lines won't be crossed. And those red lines are pretty straightforward. You know, you have to observe the rules of the basic law, the mini constitution of Hong Kong, and of course you have to also observe the constitutions in the mainland, right? And of course you cannot advocate independence of Hong Kong from China, especially in the contemporary art. Contemporary art itself sometimes can be quite offensive, So you bound to have people that those who like and appreciate the arts, some don't. But so long that we don't have any infringement of the law, I don't see there's any problem with it.
After the successful implementation of the new security law, and as Hong Kong continues to adjust to this new political reality, a new electoral law has been passed. It will give Beijing more power to appoint and remove lawmakers on Hong Kong's Legislative Council. Has Hong Kong lost what little democracy it already has? And what will the future be for the city's democratic movement? First, it was the new security law. And then, reforms to overhaul the city's electoral system. More rules appear to have been imposed by Beijing on Hong Kong to keep politicians and pro-democracy activists in the Special Administrative Region on a tight leash. On May 27, 2021, Hong Kong's legislature passed a sweeping electoral reform bill which will give Beijing more power to appoint or remove lawmakers in the territory's Legislative Council. The move came barely 2 months after a resolution was passed by the National People's Congress of China to rewrite the electoral rules for Hong Kong. Among others, the number of directly elected representatives in the Legislative Council will be slashed from 35 to 20. LegCo's size, on the other hand, will now be increased from 70 to 90 seats, thereby diluting the influence of democratically elected politicians. But that's not all. A new body has also been created to vet candidates and decide who can contest in the election. Those deemed insufficiently patriotic towards China will be barred from standing. The question is, how does one determine just who is a patriot?
Patriots is very simple. You have to, of course, observe the Chinese constitution. You have to agree to the mini constitution of Hong Kong, the basic law, and that is that simple. You know, you cannot turn against China. No, you can, but you can't serve in the government if you don't agree to the constitution of China or the mini constitution of Hong Kong, the basic law. So that's what patriot is all about.
The changes were initiated by the central authorities in Beijing. They are necessary because we want to rule out the risk of important positions of power falling into the hands of those who are hostile to China and could endanger China's sovereignty and security. The guiding principle behind the electoral changes is patriots govern Hong Kong. This was spelled out as early as 40 years ago by Mr. Deng Xiaoping. If Hong Kong falls into the hands of those who are hostile to China and could endanger China, one country, two systems, our separate system, cannot possibly continue. So it's important to implement these electoral changes.
But pro-democracy activists have described the change to the electoral system as a step back for democracy. Just in November last year, most of Hong Kong's pro-democracy legislators resigned en masse in protest of the removal of 4 of their colleagues. They were accused by Beijing of being insufficiently loyal to Beijing and deemed a threat to national security. Emily Lau, for one, feels that the electoral law simply runs counter to the spirit of democracy granted to the territory as part of the handover agreement.
I guess many Hong Kong people would be disenfranchised because their representatives or the people they favor probably will not be allowed to stand for election or probably will not want to stand for election. And some people said, even if you people stand, we're not going to vote for you. So it is a very unhappy society. But Beijing seemed to think that this is a good way of ensuring that the legislature will support the administration.
This is a term actually appearing in recent years. I would say that it's a very blurred term. Beijing can define the term. Maybe it's about who actually are pro-government, then they will think you are qualified for governing Hong Kong. So now it looks like if you are going against government policy, then it means that you are not a part of a so-called governing team. A lot of people argue that before national security law, it was a kind of old Hong Kong. Now it's a new Hong Kong.
But the idea of a new Hong Kong has little appeal to the people of the city. Just in November last year, pro-democracy candidates won a landslide victory in the district council elections. The Pan-Democrats won 347 out of the 452 seats that were up for grabs and have control of 17 out of the 18 district councils. The landslide victory represented a clear sign of where the people stood on the issue. That is also the position taken by a student at the Chinese University of Hong Kong who wants to be known only by pseudonym James.
We treat that district council election as a referendum to show our dissatisfaction towards the government and to once again show our clear stance that we want the government to restart the political reform. That's why the election is very important. Hong Kong people, especially those who have long been fighting for democracy, and long to see the universal values to be manifested in Hong Kong. And actually, the Hong Kong people just kind of remind the Central People's Government to keep his promise, as stated in the Basic Law.
But that's not about to happen anytime soon. The last vestiges of Hong Kong's democracy appear to be fading. If anything, Beijing's grip over Hong Kong has been further tightened following the latest changes made to the city's security and electoral laws. For James, who had once considered a career in the civil service, has now abandoned that dream. He feels the profession no longer serves the interests of the people.
I want to be a civil servant. Before, I used to have this kind of thoughts. Civil servants, that means servants of the people. But now it's all about servants of the government. And you have to be very sensitive of what you are talking about in the office. But before, I think it's quite free, or you just serve the people. It's much more meaningful before.
The concern among Hong Kongers is the newly expanded Legislative Council will turn out to be nothing more than a mere rubber stamp following sweeping changes to its electoral system. The government, however, disagrees.
I do not believe that it will turn the legislature into a rubber stamp government, because those who got elected, no matter they got elected by way of the functional constituencies or direct elections or by way of the so-called election committee, they are still answerable and accountable to the people. Beijing's leader also expect these 90 newly elected legislators to tackle Hong Kong issues. So all eyes on them. So they're not going to be a yes man. They will work hard for their constituencies and putting more pressure on Hong Kong government.
I think there are many capable people in Hong Kong, whether it is in finance, in business, in academia, in the professions. There are many. But do you think these people would want to go in and just become a puppet or just be there to echo what Beijing wants? No. So I just, I just find it very, very sad. We've never had democracy, but we were making tiny steps forward because many people who want to stand will not be allowed to. They'll be disqualified, or they are in fact in prison. They can't stand. So if that's the case, it's not independent, it's not free. So what for?
What will these changes mean for Hong Kong's reputation as a financial and business hub? Will businesses and investors remain committed to the city's future? Or will these new laws send them packing? Hong Kong is widely regarded as one of the world's leading financial centers. The city is home to numerous financial institutions which thrive under effective and transparent regulations coupled with a sound legal system. But a series of changes to its domestic laws have spooked many investors due to concern over the loss of freedoms. Others have lamented about the possibility of an exodus of talent and capital from the city, and that could potentially threaten Hong Kong's status as a leading business and financial hub. There's also a growing perception that China doesn't need Hong Kong as much as it used to due to its reduced importance to China's economy. For example, Hong Kong accounted for 27% of the Chinese economy back in the 1990s. Today, it represents less than 3%. It has now been overtaken by other Chinese megacities such as Shenzhen, Beijing, Shanghai, Chongqing, and Guangzhou. All these cities have seen phenomenal growth since the 90s as China's business and manufacturing hubs.
In terms of international financial center, it's a business of 100 years. It's not the system actually endorsed by Beijing. So international financial hub usually has lots of characters, for example, like rule of law, like freedom of speech, like free flow of money. But now the problem is we have no idea about Hong Kong's future. In terms of rule of law, people also still guess whether this kind of so-called Mainland-style law system will jeopardize the common law system in Hong Kong. So many businesses actually withdraw from Hong Kong because of this reason, because they have no idea whether they will get punishment in the end, because they have no idea what the national security law means.
But it will be hard to imagine how Hong Kong's status as a leading financial hub can be shaken by these latest developments. The fact is, Hong Kong remains one of the easiest places to do business. It also serves as an important conduit for global finance and trade between the East and the West. That is also the view of many businessmen, including Rick Quinn.
I still believe Hong Kong will be the Asia's international financial center. So first of all, Hong Kong still be the largest IPO market, not even in Asia, but also globally. And second is that there are a lot of demand to go inside China to invest China from global, so international monies. And how they can do that? They need to flow through Hong Kong. So Hong Kong is still at this key position.
Hong Kong Monetary Authority estimates that $50 billion have flown into Hong Kong in the past year. We are the world's #1 in IPOs, And I won't cite specific companies, but I know many are banking on the opportunities brought about by Greater Bay Area. We are a city of 7.5 million, but Greater Bay Area is a region of 72 million. Young, vibrant, middle-class population. A lot of people are looking at that, using Hong Kong as the base. We don't have to position ourselves in any particular way financially. We already are a global financial hub. I know many members of the business community remain bullish about our future, given the Greater Bay Area factor, and also they welcome the return of law and order, peace and stability.
However, not everyone shares this rather bullish sentiment about Hong Kong. Beijing's growing interference into Hong Kong's internal affairs over the past year has left many Hong Kongers feeling pessimistic about the city's future. A poll conducted by a Chinese university showed that 57.5% of residents between 15 and 30 years old would opt to leave Hong Kong if they could. In fact, many have already made plans to do so. Taiwan has welcomed thousands of white-collar workers and students from Hong Kong. Britain has also launched a new route to residency for people from Hong Kong, with more than 34,000 people applying in the first 2 months of this year. But despite the rising number of Hong Kongers who are seeking to move overseas, there are many like Shirley who have chosen to stay behind and keep fighting.
I think I won't leave Hong Kong for good. Like if it's occasionally if there's some job opportunity, whatever, like 1 year or 2 years, that would be fine, but not for good. I trust the people here. I trust the people around me. And if I lost this trust, then I better die, I guess. It's meaningless, and it's so sad that if you don't trust people around you, if you don't trust Hong Kong people, then there's no future. It's not about the government. Nobody trusts the government anymore. But it's about the people. It's about the solidarity here.
For those who want to leave, well, I think I respect their choice. And those who want to stay, good. Stay and let's work together. I always hope that the Hong Kong people will have the freedom of choice. And I hope that some will be free to say, I will stay.
People have declared the death of Hong Kong. We have always bounced back. And people who battled against Hong Kong by moving away, selling their properties, have burned their fingers. This is, again, nothing new. In the past 50 years, I have seen waves of emigration and waves of returning immigrants, you know. Hong Kong is a free society. Hong Kong people enjoy the freedom movement under the basic law, you know. Those who want to leave, I wish them well.
With each passing day, the line that separates Hong Kong and mainland China is fading much faster than anyone could ever imagine. While residents of this thriving metropolis have been trying hard to preserve their rights, freedoms and democracy under the doctrine of one country, two systems, it appears that China has had enough of the increasing defiance and the dueling identities. Today, the rules have been rewritten for Hong Kong in a bid to regain respect that China demands from residents of the city. That strategy seems to have worked in the government's favor so far.
At least you don't see any more violence on the streets, not like what you saw in the second half 2019, where you see shops being attacked, bystanders being attacked, or people who disagree with the opposition being attacked. All these are no longer happening. So I think clearly the national security law has helped to bring calm and peace to return to the city.
Well, as I said, there are people who are afraid, which we understand, but there are those who are quite determined because they love Hong Kong, they love this city, and they want to carry on with the struggle. I'm quite certain that in spite of the fact that self-censorship, fear, and so on, there are people who will carry on, but I hope they will do it in a peaceful and non-violent way.